WLS,
hosted by IDM.
And we are live today, yes, it's not recorded. Welcome back again, everybody. I can see, hello from Greece, Trakas, hello Trakas. Hello everybody, and we are back again with the 40th episode of the
Welcome to
Show.
Another fun-filled installment of the Winter Latina Show, where we talk about fun things like nukes and potential death and destruction through nukes, with a little bit of humor, of course, on the side, because how else could you discuss such a difficult subject? As you could probably tell, I'm a little bit jittery because I've been awake since 3 o'clock in the morning, so I'm very caffeinated. I'm ready to go. I'm hoping that I'm not going to crash halfway through the episode, but if I do, it might add to entertainment value of this particular episode. That does not normally happen. Usually we just have dogs, but everyone is used to the dogs. We have babies crying, but you know, I think everyone's getting used to that as well. So that would be something new. So if you see my head plopping and smashing the keyboard, that's why. How are you, Marcelo? Are you also as sleep deprived as I am?
Yeah. Just yesterday I had a conversation with Larry Johnson and I said that I am ready for CIA, what's it called, torture sections. They cannot beat it.
Careful what you wish for, Marcelo. I thought CIA torture was more about sleep deprivation as opposed to... That's the joke. Yeah, he's like, I'm so sleep deprived. I'm going to surpass. Well, we're not going to mention the program because I don't know what the YouTube censors would think about it. But anyway, on this episode, by the
way, Mr. Coffee just say hi from the United States. I'm not kidding.
Oh no, as soon as I said we don't want any dog entertainment, there's like dogs jumping at me from above. This is a little early. This normally happens at the end of the episode. What's going on? I just ruined my hair by taking you out in the snow and you're annoying me in the middle of the episode. Okay, she just wanted to show her beautiful blue eyes in the camera and now she's gone.
Beautiful blue eye.
One eye, yes, exactly. Beautiful blue, a heterochromic eye. So what we want to talk about is the update to Russia's nuclear doctrine, which happened yesterday. But I'd like to preface this with a very interesting poll that Gallop, which is not a Russian company, as we know, released yesterday. And it was basically a public opinion amongst Ukrainians. And according to Gallop, 52% of Ukrainians, so that's more than twice the number from the original poll in 2022, are ready for a very swift end to the war in Ukraine. And that is across all regions. We can link the poll, by the way, to this YouTube. It's on my X/Twitter. And even those that are way removed from the front, so past Kiev in the west being, the most Russophobic regions, they're ready to end the war. So 52%. The interesting thing about this is that they're also ready for territorial concessions, which usually doesn't really get described in the Western media. So people in that country are so sick of the fighting and the losses that more than half of them are ready to end it. And the other interesting thing about that poll is that they would prefer the Europeans to act as mediators, not the US, which I thought was very interesting, considering that by some estimates, some would claim that Britain is more involved in that war than the US, but for some reason, Ukrainians seem to trust the US less than the UK. This could be a separate discussion. But anyway, this was very interesting that came out because Ukraine's Western allies clearly are not ready to end the war, and it seems like they're ready to escalate it. So the other news we've received in the last couple of days was the fact that the US has authorized, scare quotes, Ukraine to use its weapons that are longer range than before and launch them deeper into basically the official borders of Russia. Now, when we say they allowed the Ukraine to do so, we all know that those weapons require information that Ukrainians do not possess. So that information has to come from the source of the weapons. And in some cases, they probably have to be operated to a significant extent by people who are not Ukrainians. So when they say they're allowed, it's basically they're allowing Ukraine to use Ukrainian land to launch these weapons. But someone else, we know who that is, would potentially be operating them. And so the way that Western media portrayed Russian response to this was on Tuesday, yesterday, Putin released an update to Russia's nuclear doctrine. That's not quite accurate, though, because this update has been discussed for months. And obviously, the news that came out of the West and out of Ukraine was perhaps one of the triggers to release the information, but it's not something that was just, a trigger-happy decision because Putin never operates in this way. So before we jump into this, Marcelo, I'd like to hear what you think about it.
Well, just on this last topic that you say, if I'm not mistaken, if it wasn't Lavrov, it was Peskov that said that, well, do not expect, cars riding to the Kremlin in the middle of the night because the decisions are already made. So
right.
It's been strategically discussed and planned, and all that seems to be, already on the account that may happen. So one thing, just Sunday, if I'm not mistaken, I tweeted. I can put it on the screen later. I tweeted something that was the new math, because people forget that war is also about math. And when you insert a new variable on the equation, well, the other side has to deal with the new equation. And I don't think this is a new variable. I have discussed yesterday with Larry Johnson, and all these things have been said for months already. Attackums. While I was tweeting this, I actually jumped over another tweet that I have done, or an episode. Oh yeah, that's it. When I was creating the thumbnail for the episode from yesterday with Larry Johnson, I just tripped on another episode that I have created with Larry Johnson like 2 months ago about the attackums. So this is not super new. The fact that today or yesterday we had already seen some type of attack from attackums, it means that it's there for a long time already, and pretending that the Russians didn't know is just,
And for those who missed it, the attack was against the Bryansk region, which is one of the border regions.
Borderland, yeah.
Borderland. It's also one of the places from which one side of my family comes from. And so even though unless I've been there as a kid, I really have no recollection. But in my mind, I do have an attachment to that particular area because of the family members that come from that region prior to moving to Moscow. And of course, that was the region that was overrun during World War II. And so my ancestors who were there were under Nazi German occupation. And I think I mentioned this in one of the earlier episodes where the younger family members try to question them about that experience, and they just never wanted to talk about it. So I think you can draw your own conclusions why they wouldn't want to discuss this. But so there is sort of all that really important history from World War II. And I know we keep bringing up World War II to compare and contrast to the current war. So for instance, we talk about, oh, look, the trenches look like they're from World War I or World War II, and the fighting is taking place in the same parts of the Ukrainian territory as in World War II. So there's also that connection for me. So yes, this is where those weapons supposedly were supposed to hit. From what I understand, most of them were deflected by Russian air defenses, but that was the news. And so, yeah, I think the way the media is framing this as usual is, so there's sort of some truth to what they're saying For instance, the most important takeaway from the Russian nuclear doctrine, which we will discuss in detail in a few minutes, is the fact that the threshold of what a threat is and how nukes can be used in deterrence from the Russian standpoint, defensively from the Russian standpoint, has been lowered. So there are more possibilities in the way that they can be used compared to the previous update that came in 2022. And of course, the original doctrine is from the year 2000. So it's been updated a number of times since then. So that part that I like to peruse the Western media to see how they frame things. So that part is true. And we'll talk about that momentarily. However, when they talk about, Putin's threats and just using very exaggerated language, talking about how it's nuclear. No, I don't think they use the word brinkmanship. I can't remember, but it was something along the line of threats. And usually, if you actually Google this without using a VPN and you Google it in Russian by using Google, you don't really get any Russian sources. You get like Deutsche Welle in Russian. You get the BBC in Russian. So you actually have to go to Yandex to see what the actual Russians in Russia are saying without having the filter of the Western media in the Russian language. But anyway, so the way that is being presented is a little bit disingenuous, to say the least, because even if these people consider Russia an opponent, in my opinion, when you're dealing with something as serious as nuclear weapons, you probably want to understand your opponent to the best of your ability. So if from Russia's perspective, this is a deterrence and this is a defensive mechanism, sort of the most extreme defensive mechanism there could be, then perhaps you should reveal that in the articles that you're publishing about the update to the nuclear doctrine. But we'll get there. We'll get there. So what I'd like to do first is, I don't want to spend too much time, and of course these are my famous last words as soon as I say, I don't want to talk about history for too long. We want to talk about history a little bit, right? We want to go back to the original development of nuclear weapons, right? So we want to talk about the fact that, everyone knows the Manhattan Project in the US was developing nukes during World War II. And there was a change in leadership, for those who don't remember, where Franklin Roosevelt passed away in the spring of 1945, and Harry Truman took over as America's leader. And so that had some impact on the interactions of the big three, right, amongst the big three, so the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union. From Stalin's perspective, he was sort of suspicious of, he would probably call them the Anglo-Americans, but he had a better relationship with FDR as opposed to Churchill for many reasons. He just got along with him better. He found Roosevelt to be more reasonable. Perhaps there was a suspicion of the UK in terms of the history of Russian-British relations over the long term. Certain things that Churchill would not agree to as well. So here we have a new president coming in, and we know that, I don't know if you remember this famous quote by Truman when he was still a senator in 1941, but he basically said, if the Russians are winning, we should support the Germans. If the Germans are winning, we should support the Russians to make sure they kill as many as possible. I don't know if Stalin was aware of this quote. I'm pretty sure Stalin was aware of everything because it was something that was published in, publicly in American newspapers in 1941. So obviously when Truman became president, everyone knew that FDR was sick, but I'm not sure if they expected him to just die. What turned out to be a month before victory in Europe, I think they thought he might last a little bit longer. So obviously as president, Truman had a little bit more responsibility, to say the least. So I'm not sure if by then he had the same kind of thinking. And of course, by then the US was, for better or for worse, an ally, right, in this group with the US, UK, and the Soviet Union. But nonetheless, I'm not sure if Stalin had a more positive opinion of Truman coming in to the big three at the tail end of World War II than he did of Roosevelt. And so if you remember the last conference, the last major wartime conference was in Potsdam in July 1945. This is where the Allies, this is after victory in Europe, right, in May 1945, they were discussing what to do with Japan. And they were pretty much set in terms of what they wanted. They talked about, seeking unconditional surrender from Japan. They received another confirmation that the Soviet Union would enter the war in the Asia Pacific theater, because now the Red Army was free, no longer having to fight in Europe. As a reminder, approximately 75% of Nazi German losses on the Eastern Front were thanks to the Soviet Union. For those who do not forget, we have to mention this every time. And so anyway, this was the setting for the wartime conference. And this is when Truman found out that the New Mexico atomic test was a success, right? So this is the weapon that ended up being used very shortly in Japan, in two cities, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Truman kind of informed in a vague way Stalin. I don't think he gave him too much information. He talked about a very powerful weapon that the United States now possessed. And there are lots of theories about using nukes on Japan. So the traditional explanation is that Japan was not surrendering, even though they were sort of done fighting and they had nothing left in them. But the very strong, I wouldn't even say it's an alternative theory, is that this was a demonstration for the Soviet Union in the early stages of the Cold War, right? So the end of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War, of the new weapon that the US possessed. So I lean towards this other part a little bit more because it was unnecessary to strike Japan, in my opinion, because the Soviet Union was about to join that fight, and they did, of course. But anyway, so Stalin pretended to not care about Truman's announcement that there's new powerful weapon that the US has successfully tested. But of course, he knew all about it, right? He had intelligence about this. He had all the necessary information. And in fact, the Soviet Union had its own nuclear program that started in 1942. So the Soviet Union wasn't too far behind the US in terms of developing nukes. But anyway, be that as it may, I'm going to look on the screen. So if I look like I'm looking on the screen, it's because I am, because I wanted to read out a couple of quotes about using nukes on the largely civilian populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, respectively, of 1945. So American historian John Dower, who's written extensively about this topic, and he's lifted interviews from documents, et cetera, called the aftermath of Hiroshima a quote-unquote living hell. But for the Americans, he said the news was, this is another historian, this is the biographer of Harry Truman. He said for the Americans, the news was a joyous reprieve, quote unquote. So the Americans perceived this as payback for Pearl Harbor, although one would make the claim that the scale of Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima and Nagasaki are just incomparable. So if your goal was revenge, I don't know how you can compare the two, but be that as it may, here's what John Dower writes about the first ever in history, actual practical use of this new weapon. Quote, "There was a widespread sense of having experienced a forbidding, surreal new dimension of existence, which no other people could hope to comprehend. Such consciousness of nuclear destruction became an integral, even if not always evident, part of all subsequent attempts to come to terms with the war's meaning. It reinforced a pervasive sense of powerlessness and lent an eerie kind of specialness to what might otherwise have felt like a pointless defeat." End quote. So, very powerful quote. I'll read you another one in a second, but just to give you context, as promised at Potsdam, the Red Army entered that theater in Asia the next day, essentially within the next 2 days. So it's like 1 million people entering Manchuria. So just to kind of show you the scale of the Soviet participation that was promised and that was delivered, again, to show you that really not necessary to use nukes on a largely civilian population with subsequent birth defects. And, we've all seen the videos, we've all seen that information in terms of what the scale is. Now, the other quote that I'd like to read to you is from a book called Facing the Mountain. It's also by an American historian. His last name is Brown. But if you Google the name, you'll come across this book. And it's about the Japanese Americans in the American armed forces in World War II. And so what we know about Japanese Americans who are US citizens is, well, lots of their parents were actually in what is euphemistically called internment camps, but what I would call concentration camps in the US. So a very interesting experience of these people fighting for the US while their parents are being imprisoned. And in fact, being very high-performing soldiers, primarily in Europe. So this particular quote comes from the sister of one of these soldiers who was an American citizen. She was ethnically Japanese, but she went to live in Japan. And she happened to live outside of Hiroshima. And she missed the nuclear strike by pure fate. She missed her train that morning. So she was very close, but she missed being killed in this particular way. So she said she, quote, saw a flash of light, unlike any light she had ever seen, end quote. And then she described, quote, the most exquisitely beautiful thing she had ever seen, end quote, which was, quote, a towering tulip-shaped cloud, end quote. Usually we talk about the mushroom cloud. This is she describes it as a flower. And then, of course, once she realized what had happened and she managed to make it to Hiroshima, the actual city from the suburbs, she talked about the city looking like the wasteland. Essentially, everything was just black smoke and ashes. And she talked about trying to help people who survived the initial strike and pouring water, quote, into the mouths of people with no faces, end quote. So very striking imagery. And this is compared to what we have today, 75 years later, more than that, right? Rudimentary nukes. We have much, much, much more powerful weapons today. So that's just to kind of give you a perspective of the impact that these weapons have, which is not to say that conventional weapons don't have terrifying impact that we see on the news every day with social media and all the reporting, right? So that just to put things into perspective. But anyway, so this is 1945. We can have a separate episode about whether or not it was necessary to strike Japan, again, primarily civilians of Japan in 1945. But by 1949, the Soviet Union developed and successfully tested its own weapons. So it was sort of 4 years behind in that regard. And so the Americans perceived it as, quote, a whole box of trouble, end quote. Probably an accurate description of what had happened, because of course by then the Americans no longer had the monopoly on this types of arms. So we know the Cold War was basically a period of rivalry between the two camps, two ideological camps, the Soviet Union, the United States. They did not ever fight directly. However, there are multiple proxy wars where they were involved to certain extents, or very involved, right? Korea and Vietnam come to mind, and there's a bunch of other places too. But despite all this, the two sides had a very clear understanding, perhaps because of the proximity, A, of World War II, B, of these nuclear strikes, of what the impact would be of using these weapons again. So, they developed the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, right? Which is abbreviated as MAD. I think that's a pretty accurate way of perceiving it. So they knew that it's sort of the most prominent doctrine of the Cold War. So they knew that a full-scale nuclear exchange would lead to the annihilation of both sides, right? So nothing would be left. And of course, the most famous example from the Cold War period is the Cuban Missile Crisis from October 1962. Now, anyone who can Google the most basic... Pardon?
Which, by the way, everybody calls the Cuban missile crisis. Nobody calls it the Turkish.
I know, nobody calls it the Italian and Turkish missile crisis. I know, I wonder why. But I think that really does the title, and it's the English name of it. In Russia, we have a different name for it. And so the interesting thing about it, of course, is that the focal point is on the fact that the Soviet Union was gearing to put nukes in Cuba, sort of next door to the United States. How dare they? Cuba obviously just had a revolution, so it had sort of an ideologically similar government to the Soviet Union. So obviously the Americans perceived this as very dangerous, and historians know this, and anyone who can go on an encyclopedia website would know that this was in response to the American placement of Jupiters in Italy and Turkey Turkey, right on the Soviet border. So this was not something that Khrushchev, who was the leader at the time, initiated. He was responding to the American actions. But be that as it may, there was this escalation. The Americans, of course, freaked out. The Soviets were not going to back down. Eventually, though, within weeks, JFK and Khrushchev had to interact and de-escalate. But this is when sort of in common lore, the world came very close to nuclear annihilation with that standoff. We know there was that famous Doomsday Clock in the Cold War period, and this is when the clock came 2 minutes to midnight. Marcelo, I'm sure you can think of a certain band that came up with a certain song called 2 minutes to midnight. So this is Iron Maiden in 1984, right? So that's another sort of famous reference in pop culture, but to just kind of show you the way to which people were aware of that nuclear threat, right? So you had famous rock bands, early metal bands, right, talking about it. I'm not sure if people today the general public is reading the news as much as people were tuned in previously. This might be because people are tired of cable news because of the half-truths or omitted information that comes from cable news, whether it's just the fact that they're more tuned in into social media, but more like the pop cultural side of social media. Be that as it may, I don't have the same sense of people being scared of the current possible nuclear escalation as much as they would have been during the Cold War. Although back then it was very much advertised in schools. People had their little exercises in public schools of hiding under desks. Exactly. Yeah, I know. That's going to help. Yeah, that's really...
I always remember South Park, when the volcano came out and dug it over and lava
very helpful,
flushing the people out. And I also don't think J-Lo and Anita are writing music about, nuclear exchange to be unite or anything like that.
Although I don't think Madonna was writing music about nuclear exchange in the 1980s, so you kind of had to have a different kind of music to even address the topic. But yeah, I mean, it's actually kind of interesting if you go back to the 80s and the early 90s and you think about, like Megadeth talking about war. So I think those bands were more political than... I don't think of any even like rock bands that would be political in this way today. So yeah, perhaps it's a combination of factors, but it doesn't seem like the general public these days appreciates the way that this situation can escalate. Hopefully it doesn't. But nonetheless, to go back to the period after 1962, that brinkmanship basically set the way for greater cooperation between the US and the Soviet Union in terms of sort of reducing. I know they never fully reduced their arms because obviously Russia and the US still lead the way in terms of having the total number of nuclear warheads. But they basically started working on mutual, despite all the differences, ideological differences, political differences, they started working on mutual arms control treaties. So the first talks they're known as SALT, right? So SALT 1 and SALT 2, strategic arms limitation talks, they happened in the early and late 1970s, respectively. Started in the late 1960s. Famously, the early ones were led from the American side, or pushed, I should say, by Kissinger, right, who recently passed away. So that was sort of an end of an era. So on the one hand, he's doing very good things in the realm of controlling nukes. On the other hand, he was doing very bad things in terms of the things that the US was doing in Southeast Asia in the context of the Vietnam War, Cambodia, and so on and so forth. So he's a very contentious personality. I know when we bring them up, people have a very dramatic response one way or another. Some people consider him this amazing statesman. Other people consider him this monster, right? So I guess it depends on...
It could be both.
It could be both. Yeah, it just depends on the focal point, I think. So anyways, he was one of the people on the US side pushing for these talks. Obviously, Brezhnev was the Soviet leader at the time in the early 1970s. And so those talks were pretty successful. Some agreements were signed. One agreement was the ABM, right, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And so this was Brezhnev and Nixon, right, who was presiding over the U.S., over Kissinger. Some would say Kissinger was more in charge in terms of foreign policy. But anyway, so this particular treaty, I mean, there are many provisions in the treaty, but it basically limited the deployment areas for a particular type of anti-ballistic missile. So some very technical information there. And then in the 1980s, right, we had Reagan, who very publicly was obviously very critical of the Soviet Union, called it the evil empire, but behind the scenes, there was quite a bit of cooperation, trade, and so on and so forth. So again, it's a very nuanced situation, as much as I hate to say that. And a certain traitor, the last leader of the Soviet Union, whose name was Gorbachev. I think I'm being visited by a second dog. This is an unusual day today. It's like running way too early.
Everybody wants to be on the screen today.
They like to talk about nukes, and he's kind of blurred because he's not right
he's
in
not
the camera.
on the focal point, yeah.
No, you're not right in the focal. Do you like nuclear
He's kind of
weapons?
all right.
Do you like nuclear weapons? No, we don't like them. I know. Who's a good boy? Who doesn't like nuclear weapons? But anyways, so the two parties in 1986, there was a famous summit in Iceland, and they were trying to reach really far-reaching agreements, and they failed. However, a more limited treaty did come to pass in 1987. This was the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. I have to look on my screen because they're all abbreviated and they have really long names, and it's impossible to remember every single one. But basically, this was about abolishing the existing stocks of shorter range and medium range land-based missiles that did have the capability of carrying nuclear warheads. And then, we're now in the period of dissolving the Soviet Union, and this is important because this is when the START treaties launched. And the last START treaty is still technically functional, but it was suspended last year, and it's not going to be renewed. So that's really important. So this is sort of like the last piece of cooperation between the US, the Soviet Union / Russia that's sort of coming out of that Cold War period, but it doesn't look like, or at least today, at the height of political tensions, it doesn't look like there's going to be another one. But be that as it may, so in 1991, there was that initial START treaty, which stands for Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. So that treaty has since been, again, it has multiple provisions about the numbers of bombers, about the numbers of other types like warheads that they can carry. Again, a lot of very technical information, but both parties agreed to this. And during the presidencies, respectively, of Obama and Medvedev, which Medvedev was in his liberal phase, although who knows if his current hawkish phase is real or not. Maybe he's had enough. He's always been a hawk. But be that as it may, the newer update to the START treaty happened during the presidencies of those two. And so this is the treaty that's still functional until 2025, and the Russian side with the latest developments. Last year it got suspended, but Russia was still sort of following the provisions of the treaty, although it's suspended. I mean, it's sort of like a half suspension, I guess. I don't know how else to describe it. So officially they suspended it, but they're still following certain provisions from it. But more recently, they released the information that after this treaty expires, there's not going to be a new one. It's sort of like the last big piece of cooperation between the two countries, which some would say is very dangerous, that there's no more talks in this regard. But yeah, this brings us to modern history. But before I jump into the actual updates to the current Russian nuclear doctrine, do you have any impressions from what I've described?
Well, yeah, one thing that is important to mention, I think, about the START treatment. Oh, dear boy. Treaty. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm in the same situation, and I'm not caffeinated.
He's not caffeinated.
But
yeah.
He's
not on any fun Zelensky medications, so yeah, maybe you should try that.
I don't do those stuff.
You'd be like that on camera. To victory!
Exactly. But I will have very bad teeth by now. But so better stay away from stuff. One thing that Scott Reeder, for example, always mentioned is the fact that even though there were these treaties, the United States was not always very accomplishing them. So example, you have to destroy this nuclear capable airplane. All right, we cut the wire and now it's not nuclear capable anymore. Dude, you can just put some tape there and it's back. You have to saw it in the middle, and yeah. And at the same time, the United States was always accusing Russia of not being very keen to the treaty. So there's
I think with the U.S., it's important to note that U.S., as being the leader of NATO, has a nuclear sharing program, right? And so obviously there are other countries in NATO, like the UK, that have nukes. Maybe this would be a good time to, can you pull up that statista graph so that people have a good idea of who has what?
You be sure it's on the right place, yes. So
yeah, but as far as NATO goes, if you guys can look at the graph, it's basically the US, the UK, and France, right? Those are sort of the three leading powers. But there's also nuclear sharing. So for instance, Poland, right? Poland, which is basically next to Russia, can host weapons on its land that have nuclear capabilities. And so this is probably what Ritter, I'm assuming this is what he was talking about, where yes, they might have reduced certain types of arms and certain types of planes and certain types of missiles, but at the same time, there's this territorial expansion of getting closer and closer to Russia's borders by hosting these weapons in technically non-nuclear countries that may not possess their own weapons, but have the capability of launching them very, very close to Russia. And of course, when you think about that part of the world, Kaliningrad, I should say this with more of an American accent, but it's sort of been, once the USSR dissolved, it's sort of been detached from mainland Russia, right? So it's this little Russian outpost that Russia's got as booty in World War II, right? This was Königsberg. People are still getting their panties in a bunch of, let's give this back to all the German speakers. And no, that's not going to happen. But yeah, so it's sort of this outpost there. And so on the one hand, Russia has this access. On the other hand, it's problematic where that city can be cut off, right? So that's sort of a dual-edged sword, right? So when we think about Poland, yes, there's also the issue of distance, but there's also Kaliningrad there too. So it's sort of a little bit more nuanced again. So is there anything else? Other than the U.S. sort of adhering, but not quite adhering to the terms of the treaty and constantly accusing Russia of breaking it?
Yeah, I don't want to do the devil's advocate on this one. Okay, so yeah, let's pretend none of the two were playing ball. Let's just pretend. No, both of them. I don't trust you. And then okay. In any case, there was a treaty, and it was being slightly done. Not necessarily perfect, but there was something. As soon as
just a lot of discussion. Again, if you go back to the Cold War, since the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a lot of communication. And remember, this is all happening with the backdrop of the Vietnam War going on, with the African decolonization and Angola, and there is a lot of fighting going on, and some of it can be considered proxy fighting, right? There are some places that, let's say, Cuba supported more than the Soviet Union, some places like Vietnam, obviously, and Korea, where the US was directly involved. But all of this is happening as there are hot wars happening on the planet, much like there is this proxy war with Russia and NATO using, NATO using Ukraine as its proxy. So a little bit different, I would say. It seems like diplomacy is at a very, very low point compared to what we thought was the biggest global conflict of the world, right? In the history of the world. And are. I'm sure there's some kind of backdoor communication between the militaries to make sure that nothing awful happens. We had our Serbian specialist a couple weeks ago talking about this. And a lot of people suspect this is the case. Obviously, it's all rumored because this is not something that's going to be released to the media. But in terms of official diplomacy and having these official meetings and talks like SALT 1 and SALT 2 that I just mentioned to you, these summits between Reagan and Gorbachev, etc. This is just not happening. And the lack of talking is obviously problematic, even if each side would consider the other an opponent, an adversary, an enemy, whatever term you prefer to use. Eventually, there has to be some kind of communication, and it seems to be down.
Even with some level of communication, let's pretend, okay, there's no phone calls, or the other day we had a phone call between Olaf Scholz and the Putin. Even with that, there is no reasonable talks. It's you either do that or I'll do that or else.
Yeah, the beginning of, I mean, I understand that people bargain, but sort of the starting points of bargaining are so far away from each other that, because from what I understand, Scholz was like, okay, Vlad, you got to pull out your troops from Ukraine. And Vlad was like, but we're winning. Why should we be, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's just like, what is even the point of this? You're not even bringing a reasonable bargaining starting point to the table. So what is even the point of this phone call?
And even without that direct connection, you always have, the media. The media outlets are a good place for seeing this. If you see the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, all of that, those things are made to propagate whatever the government's thinking, or whatever the deep state's thinking, or whatever the military is thinking.
Or to plant a certain idea and to see what the reaction would be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even like that, when you pick up Western, if you look at TASS, and you can see some floating ideas there. But when you pick up Western newspapers and outlets, Deutsche Welle, whatever you pick, it's always you have to fulfill Zelensky's plan or else. There is not a drop of
this is why I mentioned the Gallop poll in the beginning, because this is a poll coming from a non-Russian, non-Ukrainian source, right? It's supposed to be objective, I mean, for what that's worth. And more than half of the population of the country that is where the war is taking place wants it to end as soon as possible, to the point where they're ready to give up their land, or I mean certain sections of their land. And obviously, as that's happening, there's this escalation. So there's this complete disconnect between what the people of that country want versus what the Western allies want. And I mean, that is a very clear indication, once again, of the famous caustic, very gallows humor quote of "to the last Ukrainian." I mean, that demonstrates "to the last Ukrainian," which is very horrifying and tragic, because, these days, a lot of those people are just being pulled off the streets. They're not all that keen about fighting. I mean, yes, if you look at that poll, again, if it's to be believed, there is a certain percentage, it's less than half, that is still wanting to continue fighting, but it's definitely reducing every month, right? It's decreasing every month. So
even because the people that are willing to fight are dying. So
well, that's true, but also, yeah, I mean, and a lot of them are abroad and not really wanting to. I mean, this was interesting because I don't know if you saw, I posted statistics, and some people were freaking out because they're coming from the FSB, right? The Russian security intelligence, internal intelligence, domestic intelligence, and they're like, oh, the FSB. It's like, well, they're the ones screening who is coming in from a state, official enemy state. Well, I don't know if it's not designated as enemy state, but right. So yes, it's going to be this government body that's going to be screening them. So yes, their statistics are probably pretty accurate. But anyway, they had a statistic of over 100,000 Ukrainians trying to enter through this one airport in Moscow, the international airport at Sheremetyevo. And they let in more than 3/4 of these Ukrainians coming in with Ukrainian passports, and they had to send back. So I think it was like 78/3 22-ish or so. I think that was sort of anyway. So it's still a very large number of Ukrainians. I mean, with the initial stages of the war, a lot of Ukrainians, right, from Eastern Ukraine, from the south, fled to Russia. That number is in the millions from 2014, but even in 2022. But even now, these were the statistics from October 2023 up until October 2024. So 100,000 Ukrainians trying to get in for this one airport. Like, that's a big number into a country that's attacking you.
Just to draw the picture, I have a very good friend, fantastic. He even came to a show in my channel once. He's a lawyer in Brazil. He's from a family that is a Russian-Ukrainian diaspora. And at the beginning, when everything began, he was very upset with Russia and all that. And very rapidly, he contacted his family in Russia and Ukraine. The Ukrainians moved to Russia, and they were saying, "Oh, look, this is crazy. Do not keep thinking that Ukraine is the poor country here." And I'm talking about someone that I know. I'm from Brazil, that lives in Brazil. I know, and I live in Italy. And it came to me, this information. Plus, of course, I know a lot of Ukrainians, and I got the big picture just in the beginning, only in the beginning on that.
Yeah, I mean, it is anecdotal, but I think the statistics are pretty interesting when you have numbers in the millions that surpass, I think, Poland, which is the sort of the country in the EU that had the greatest number of refugees coming in. So that was very significant. But yeah, still seeing, like I was thinking like, okay, we're now going on how many years of this war? Like, there's no way that many of them are trying to move to Russia through Moscow, through the central like the central international airport. No, they're still going there. So, and some of them are coming through third countries, so they would be going, let's say, through Turkey. So, they clearly aren't trying to be refugees elsewhere. They want to go to Russia. So I think, again, this is a piece of information that's missing from the Western media, and I wonder why. But yeah, the people that were turned away, I think the security services are screening their social media and just seeing, obviously they don't want to let in any sabotage groups, because we've already had incidents like this, and for people who look the same and speak the same language, it's a lot easier to blend in and pretend to be a refugee. But yes, having the aggressor country continue taking in these refugees, I think is very, very interesting. But yeah, no one seems to be listening to the general public in the country that's basically the site. I know, why bother when you can continue testing weapons and writing off
and
budgets
making a hell lot of money.
Yes, exactly. But let's get into the doctrine. So like I said, the initial one is from the year 2000, and it's been updated in 2020. And so the new one is, this is the year when it's been updated some more. And so the biggest updates, there are two biggest updates. And of course, there's a lot of detail, and I'm going to have to keep looking on my screen because it's like really specific language. So number one, the number of threats has been expanded from 6 to 10. So from 2020 to 2024, the one that came out yesterday. And the number of scenarios of using nuclear weapons in an extreme case scenario has risen from 4 to 5. So there's one new scenario that's been added. I'm going to read it off the screen just so that you have the wording. I'm translating it directly from the Russian. So according to this completely brand new scenario, Russia may use nukes upon, quote, receiving reliable information about a massive launch or a takeoff of air and space attack weapons. And then it lists the types of weapons. So these could be strategic or tactical aircraft, cruise missiles, unmanned weapons. This one was interesting to me because that sounds like drones. I know we use the term drones to describe lots of different things, but there's been so many drone attacks on Russia. This was interesting to me. Hopefully some military expert can explain this to me, why that's there and if that's a change. Hypersonic and other aircraft, and basically crossing the official state border of the Russian Federation. So this is the new scenario of where Russia can or may use nukes. But overall, Russia still considers, so this is not a change, it still considers nuclear weapons, quote, as a means of deterrence. And the use of such weapons, quote, happens in extreme scenarios as a necessary measure, end quote. And it's going to use all means necessary to reduce nuclear threats and not use such weapons because it doesn't want to aggravate relations between different countries that could provoke other military conflicts, including nukes. Now, the guaranteed deterrence of a potential adversary is sort of one of the main points in this doctrine. That hasn't really changed much. I mean, there's a little bit of a change in verbiage. And basically, both the new document and the old document talk about the defensive nature of using nukes. I think this is the piece of information, like I said, that's usually missing from the Western media. It talks about nuclear blackmail, threats, et cetera, But again, if you want to understand the party that has the greatest number of missiles, like the diagrams that we just showed you guys, it's probably good to understand their perspective that deterrence and defensive measures are the top two factors here. But the Western media, like I said, is not wrong in the sense that the threshold has been lowered. So, for example, I don't know if you saw this part, but basically there's this idea that nukes can be used against a non-nuclear country if it's working with another nuclear country. So again, if you think about Ukraine working with NATO, specifically US, France, and Britain, the nuclear possessing countries, that would qualify in the situation. And also, if one member of an alliance is using nukes, that means the entire alliance could potentially be the target. So again, a lower threshold. The other interesting thing here is that Belarus has been included with special guarantees of protection. Obviously, Belarus has been playing a special role in the war in Ukraine, but also Belarus has been sort of integrating with Russia for the past couple of decades. It's in a union state, which means the two countries are sovereign and separate, but they're pretty integrated economically. Now they're integrated militarily. And so Belarus is included in terms of being threatened in the ways that the doctrine describes. And so the thing that's new here as well compared to the 2020 version is that we're no longer talking about threats to the very existence of both states, but we're talking about what's described as a critical violation of their sovereignty and territorial integrity. So that could be read, again, that sounds a lot lower to me in terms of the bar, right? Existence versus sovereignty, territorial integrity, how that's being interpreted. You know, I can interpret this in many ways. I think you can too. I mean, it does have the examples of literally crossing the border of these particular types of aircraft. So yes, that's a violation of territorial integrity. But I think it can also be interpreted in other ways. And, you know, a document is a document as long as it's being interpreted by someone. So I think there's that issue here. Do you have any thoughts before I go down and I give a couple more points?
I would like to say one thing that I have realized back at the time. I was supposed to make a video about this and I didn't because I was becoming a father. So just it was a crazy moment. The thing that I realized on seeing this, because you see, a doctrine is a doctrine. Yeah, of course you have to follow it. But, you know, if there is big things on stake here, you're not going to, you know, build a trial, call some lawyers, let's analyze this. You're just going to push the button. We have to understand that. But having a doctrine is important because it stays. It perdures for next presidents and whatever comes after this moment. But when I did a live stream with another another channel from Brazil the other day, and one thing that I realized was that when Russia came with these changes that were a couple of months ago, and now this one, what they are doing is that they are working the bureaucratic mind. And this, what do I mean? Are they working the Russian bureaucratic mind? No, the American bureaucratic mind, because these people, they think different.
Legalistically.
They think bureaucratically. It's not even legalistically, because a lawyer or a jurisdiction person is able to reason mathematically. These people think in a bureaucratic way. So for this to happen, you have to stamp this document, go there, get signatures, blah, 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 blah. And that's what they do. That's why they do proxy wars, because what they see is that,
it's not us.
It's not us. Yeah, we go to the UN, we say it's not us. Well, it is not us. What can they do? Nothing. And then we win, because it's a proxy. They die, we win. The other side does not see like that. People do not see like that. People actually are capable of reasoning and seeing what is happening behind the scenes, behind the curtain of bureaucracy. When the Duma and Putin and whoever rewrites these bureaucratic clause to the doctrine, what they are saying is, look, I'm writing an anti-Article 5. So you have your Article 5, fine. Now I have this. Try messing with me. Try sending your proxy to mess with me. I'm going to blame you. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to blame you. And now it's on paper. It's
now
written.
It's codified. Yeah, now it's codified. Yeah, no, that's how I interpreted the statement about non-nuclear states working in an alliance or coalition. And it has a bunch of verbiage describing what the formations are. I think exactly like you're saying, it's using that legalistic / bureaucratic language to cover different types of cooperation between, e.g., right, Ukraine and NATO countries, so that it's all covered in there. But let me read out a couple of other things from sort of the updates to the doctrine. And some of them might be sort of not massive updates, but sort of renewed language. The first two that I named were the newer features that got added just now. But basically, what else? That the other thing that it mentions is that a threat is also qualified as a creation and expansion of units that bring military infrastructure closer to the borders of the Russian Federation. The isolation of part of Russia's territory blocking access to transport communications. I was thinking Kaliningrad, but this could pertain to other parts of Russia as well. The destruction of environmentally hazardous facilities. You know, we can think of a few attacks on the Russian Federation in terms of oil refineries and so on and so forth that could lead to, nuclear, of course, yes, but also other types of energy, right? Lead to man-made environmental and social disasters and planning and conducting military exercises near borders. Like that one is very vague, or I mean, we know NATO loves to conduct military exercises within 300 meters of Russia's borders in Estonia, right? So that I thought was very interesting. Again, I don't know who is going to be interpreting it and how. Like you're saying, it might not be a lawyer. It might be like press the button, which is kind of scary. And the other thing that comes here, let me see. Oh yeah, okay, so. The previous conditions talk about, threats to the existence of the state. So I already mentioned that. Now it's more about the critical facilities that could disrupt the responses of the Russian Federation. So again, it's a little bit lower of a threshold. I mentioned the aircraft. And and of course, there's a clause of compliance with international obligations in the field of arm control. this is why we discussed some of these treaties. This has been replaced by the principle of centralized use of nuclear weapons, including those deployed outside the Russian Federation. I'm assuming this is referring to Belarus. So these are sort of some of the major changes. Like I said, the top two were the number of threats and the number of scenarios. Those are the ones that are different, and they have been expanded. But also the verbiage in some of the other clauses has been changed, and the threshold, once again, the bar has been lowered. So what do you think?
Yeah, so I again, the bar can go lower, and I don't think they are going. So just had a question here on the in Portuguese on the chat asking. So Russia is not going to do anything. Basically, I guess no. I would guess no. Unless
do anything in what regard? Like, is it going to shoot at Poland? Like, what do anything in what?
I mean, yeah, it's a very vague question. But basically, what I see is that. So we were mentioning the Bryansk attack recently. Mm-hmm. It was an attack. Mm-hmm. Will they respond? Because then it comes to the Western mind of panic and craziness. Just push the button and start throwing nukes everywhere. They're not going to do that. I don't see them doing that. I think they will be able. I really don't think it's going to happen. It's a personal view. Okay, I do not doubt it may happen. But the latest videos that have been flowing on Twitter, I'm kind of relieved that Italy is not on the targets. Although I know people in France, Germany, and England, so I prefer that they does not do it. But what I think is it's not, as I said, it's not that much about lowering the threshold for for pressing the button, but blaming the right person. Okay, so. What I've seen also on Twitter these days, floating this video of, Putin say, "Hurrah," and then Kiev burning. I don't think they're going to shoot Kiev. I think they're going to put the dots and say, "I blame you for this, and I'm going to shoot you." And I'm looking at Britain here. I'm going to shoot you. And first
of all, I mean, if we kind of pull back from this a little bit, obviously, when you issue a statement as your presidency is about to come to an end, that your proxy war underling is now able to shoot, quote unquote, someone is going to provide them information. We could possibly know who that might be, shoot deeper into the Russian territory. I mean, that is an escalation. So there's no way that Russia can just swallow that and say nothing, right? So there has to be some kind of a response. So obviously the release of this information about the updated nuclear doctrine, even though it's been clearly worked for a while, clearly the timing was timed in a particular way. So I mean that is, from the PR perspective, this is what happened, even though it's something that's been developed for a while. But at the same time, what the West has been doing on its side is it's been playing this game of nuclear brinkmanship, and it's been sort of ignoring Russia's red lines. And Russia has to respond in some way. When we say red lines, we talked about this before. It's not so much the red line of a statement, don't do this or I'll do this. It's also there's a time continuum. Something, remember we talked about this, where something in July 2024 may just be ignored, and maybe there is a perception of weakness in December 2024, it might not be ignored. So there's also that time factor that's playing out that's important. And the allowing of the permission again, scare quotes, for Ukraine to use these longer range weapons. I mean, it comes with, well, not just the polls coming out of Ukraine that they're completely sick of war, but also the front in the forward eastern Ukraine is collapsing. Russia has been advancing massively. I'm not even watching every single village that they take, but whenever I tune into social media or the media, it's like every day there's a bunch of different towns and villages that are being mentioned as having been some people would say liberated, some people would say conquered. You can take a guess which one which term I would use, but for the sake of being on YouTube, I'm not going to use it. But anyway, so there are clearly a lot of developments happening there, and the Russian army has been advancing. I mean, the Western media, for all its lies that it's issued in the past, it's kind of been forced into admitting the fact that front is collapsing for Ukraine. So that's another background, right? So yes, there might be permissions to use certain types of weapons, and they have been supposedly launched into Bryansk, then they've been mostly deflected. But war goes on, right? There is, and this is why when that news about, let's freeze the conflict with the new presidency in the US and let's just kind of make it a North-South Korea scenario. From what I've seen, at least coming from Peskov as being the official spokesperson for the Kremlin, I know he's made a couple of mistakes. I'm sure this was not one of them, but he said this is not something that's acceptable. So, I mean, Russia obviously knows that if it's gaining ground and it's going to reach whatever objectives is in the mind of the Kremlin officials, we don't know what they are. I know what I would do as a non-military person, what I think would make sense. And we had multiple analysts here talking about the left bank of the Dnieper, the right bank of the Dnieper, right? There's all that type of analysis. So I know what I would do if I were in that position, but we don't know what information they have. We don't know what their goals are like. We don't know if they're thinking 15 years from now and the parts of Ukraine that are not going to be conquered or liberated, depending on what you see by Russia, that they may come later peacefully. So we don't know what discussions they're having. But anyway, so there is that happening with all of that exchange going on. But just in general, I think even though initially I thought the nuclear threat was exaggerated, and I think a lot of people in the media and social media, they just love the clickbait of sharing images of mushrooms clouds and all these simulations that are terrifying. And we all have families all over the place on both continents, right? And, you know, in Russia, in Europe, in North America. So none of us have bunkers. So obviously we might have a particular opinion about a government of a certain country, but we also would prefer to see our families and be alive, right? So, I mean, I think it's kind of even if this threat is exaggerated, we still have a healthy sense of wanting to be alive on this planet for a little while longer, right?
Just yesterday in this conversation with Larry Johnson, one point that he rose that I think it's interesting. Well, with Biden leaving the scenario, they need a little bit of drama, because things are not going, and you just mentioned that, you know, the front lines are collapsing, things are not looking good at all for Ukraine, and they need a little bit of drama, you know, and they did. This is even, from what I understood, his declaration for the usage for allowing Ukraine to use these missiles, it's not even something very confirmed. It's something that floated out of some newspapers.
Yeah.
Lucas Leroy, who you knew here in the channel, made a great article for Geostrategic Culture today, where he mentions also that it was not exactly said by Biden, but at the same time, it wasn't denied. So
yeah, no, it came from sort of official media. From what I've seen, it hasn't been confirmed, but it was never denied either. And then, of course, it permeated. And again, it's kind of like you say, the media is being used to let out these feelers to see how the other side would respond. But
at the same time, Trump did not make a declaration, but his son came out.
Yeah, I did see that. Yeah.
His son came out about this. So what I believe in my pure mind is that...
in my pure sleep-deprived mind.
In my pure sleep-deprived and uncaffeinated mind, is that probably the phone rang somewhere between the next president and the Putin, and they have a chat. They say, look, dude, forget this senile guy. He's just wandering around. Never mind.
As if he's the
January 1st,
one
I'm going
making
to do
decisions.
something.
As if he's the one
Yeah.
making decisions,
Yeah,
as some would say.
But he would probably say, just look, January 1st, or whenever I started my mandate, I undo all that. Just relax. But of course, relaxing is also putting clear that, hey, we got your message. Here's the message for you guys.
But let's look at the development of, for the past 30 years, NATO has been moving closer and closer to Russia's borders, right? Yes, there was no written agreement in place. There's lots of documents about the negotiations. Gorbachev's statements are BS. We know that. It's because even Western media published what those negotiations were like. But even if those didn't take place, the idea of not respecting the security, the immediate security of a country that has the greatest number of nuclear warheads in history, probably not very smart, even if none of those talks took place. It just makes no sense. But okay, so there's been that escalation. And then there was what some people would call regime change in Ukraine in 2014. And that was another escalation, right? And so everyone thought that Russia was bluffing and there were these Minsk agreements. And even I didn't think there was going to be any kind of a response. And all of a sudden, there is an escalation February 2022. I was just as surprised because I thought these Westerners are going to keep pushing. And I guess I kind of underestimated the Russian side. I mean, someone in the Kremlin decided that the country had been pushed into a corner and this is a battle for survival. And I can see why they would decide that. And so we all sort of, I mean, yes, some people thought maybe it would happen. But a lot of us thought that, no, there's no way. He is bluffing. This is not going to happen. They're going to continue running over all of these red lines. And all of a sudden, this is where we are, right? We're now almost 3 years into this, the escalation of the armed conflict that started in 2014. And so, you know, the Westerners, the politicians, the media keep saying, oh, yeah, Putin is just bluffing. He's just updating this doctrine just to say something. But I mean, at some point, you know, I didn't think there would be a response to the Ukraine situation, and there was. I would prefer not to see a response to any of those escalations with the nuclear means. But I just think this idea of nuclear brinkmanship, of kind of ignoring that whole doctrine of mutually assured destruction that was born in the Cold War, is just very, very stupid. It's very reckless. And I think a lot of these people are bureaucrats. They're very much removed from actual wars. And yes, there's still military people somewhere in the background calling each other. We know that's happening even if we don't see it. But again, I think that removal from armed conflict and from seeing the results of these weapons, I think is kind of dangerous. People just started perceiving it, including these bureaucrats, as a video game. Perhaps they have really good technologically advanced bunkers. They don't have to worry about it. I don't know. But that brinkmanship is not doing any good for anyone. And so at some point, like you're going to go too far, right? Like that's the fear. So the situation, for instance, with F-16s, right? Providing F-16s, there's all this hoopla about giving them to Ukraine, not giving them to Ukraine. Finally, you know, there was a decision made, and then Russia issued a statement that we're going to interpret these airplanes, these jets, as having the capacity to be armed with nuclear warheads, right? We don't care what's in them. We're going to interpret that as a threat. And again, that was sort of ignored. And the whole situation is sort of, I mean, it's sort of happening, but we haven't really seen a lot of developments with that. But there's also been like those escalations. I think that people now that they're no longer talking about these planes, that people almost forgot about them. But that was another escalation, right? So at some point,
everything was an escalation.
Everything was an escalation.
For the last 2.5 years, slightly more than 2.5 years, we've seen javelins, we've seen HIMARS, we've seen M777 howitzers, we've seen F-16s, we've seen everything they could throw. They throw the kitchen sink over Russia, and every escalation got a response. This response, I think,
but these are all conventional weapons, which is not to underestimate conventional weapons. I mean, we've seen how many dead people are, you know, fertilizing the fields of Ukraine. I mean, that's not good, to say the least. But going from conventional to nuclear, again, thinking of the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. I mean, I would like to think that it's being exaggerated, and that from what I've seen, the people in the Kremlin have cooler heads than the people who've been escalating. But at some point, you don't know what's going to happen, right? It's a, I think it's a healthy fear to have.
Of course. No. I was about to say that. I had a live stream here with Lucas, and Lucas is probably the most decent warmonger I ever met. And I'm not smearing the guy. He's
decent warmonger.
No, because
it's like a compliment and a criticism in one.
Because he's the person that has the sanity to understand that you cannot do this, and the perception that using these should be a way out, should be considered. And I was having a live stream with him where I posed the question or the perception by watching Martyanov and other military that, hey, perhaps, just perhaps, because Russia looks very calm about all this nuclear narrative, perhaps they have capabilities that we don't know about, and they are able to easily survive an attack and perhaps not even need to respond. His answer was, and again, I posted this commentary about him just to understand. He said, look, whatever is the reality, I don't think we should ever consider not fearing nuclear weapons. Exactly what you just said. And the mutual destruction assurance should be always, whatever science you can try to use to disprove it, you shouldn't even try to disprove it. Just philosophically have this in mind, for Christ's sake, just have this in mind. Don't try to do math over this, because if someone comes out with an idea that, perhaps you can survive.
And we have seen articles like that. Yeah, we have seen articles like that. So what impact will World War III have on investors? It's like, thank you, media. That's a real article. Go look it up after this episode. Yeah.
Buy Bitcoins.
Well, I don't think they were promoting Bitcoin, but I think it was literally like how will World War III affect investors? This is like one of the famous headlines over the past couple of years. So yeah, someone in the media is a little bit disconnected from reality. Again, perhaps they have a really good bunker and a supply of food for several years. I don't know, but I do not. So it would be really nice for the side that's been consistently escalating to have a little bit of a dose of reality. And I don't want that dose of reality come from something like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, because that escalation is the thing that kind of sobered everyone up, right? I can take sides in that equation, but again, had there been a nuclear exchange, it doesn't matter what side. I mean, you and I would not exist, right? So we're not quite that old. But so I don't want a Cuban Missile Crisis Part 2 with the potential threat of using nukes coming to 2 minutes to midnight, right? And then people on the Western side sober up a little bit. We probably shouldn't continue playing with nuclear brinkmanship. This is probably not the best idea. So I really hope it's not an event like the Cuban Missile Crisis Part 2. But who knows? I'm not sure if those people are really as disconnected from reality as I perceive them to be, or if they really underestimate Russia, thinking, it's bluffing, which I wouldn't even do that with like Iran, which has, supposedly has a much, much, much smaller number of nukes, or North Korea, which or none, or North Korea, which according to the graph now has 50, right? It was able to develop its own weapons despite the sanctions and the isolation. So I probably wouldn't play that with North Korea with its 50, definitely not with Russia with its, what is it now? 5,580. Yeah, almost 6,000, right? 6,000 nuclear warheads. So yeah, it's almost like if you don't want to play that game with North Korea, with little North Korea, probably shouldn't be playing that game with Russia, even if you don't like Russia and even if you consider it as adversary. So again, in my opinion, I always promote diplomacy. I kind of lament the fact that diplomacy seems to be, or the training of diplomats seems to be dead in the US. I mean, this is why I keep bringing up Kissinger, because he seems to be, for all the awful things that he had done in Southeast Asia, he was very diplomatic and very capable when it came to the two superpowers. So we can sort of isolate the two. I know some people really disagree with that approach, but these days, the people that get appointed, they're usually political appointments in the US. They're usually people who do not, let's say they're an ambassador, they're usually people who don't speak the language of whatever the country they're being sent to. Whereas in Russia, they kind of have to speak English and the language, and perhaps two languages of whatever the region is. So they're usually much, much more well-versed in the languages, in the culture, in the history. They're better educated, and by definition, that's going to create a better reception in the region for you as a diplomat, rather than just this overlord coming in who expects you to speak English and doesn't really know much about you. So that tradition of having diplomacy essentially dying in much of the West, and in the US especially, is very, very sad. So hopefully something can happen there, and something, someone like Lavrov, I don't know if someone like Lavrov can pop up in other countries, because that's an example of a traditionally trained diplomat who's very, very successful, right? Who's been around for a long time, and he's been through a lot, if you kind of think about the periods that he's lived through. But going back to, the drawing board and going back to having talks, just having more communication, I'm always a proponent of that. I know it sounds very hokey, but that's sort of the starting point. And if we could have that during the Cold War, why can't we have that now? I think that says something about the caliber of leaders and whoever is behind the leaders, right? Put on your tinfoil hat in the official West that doesn't want that communication, where these very basic diplomatic routes and channels have essentially broken down. This is consistently what you keep seeing from the Russian side. Interviews with ambassadors from various Western countries, I sometimes look at those and they say, we would like to talk to them, but we have no way to do so because all the channels of communication have broken down. And I think when there's the idea of nuclear threats hanging over your head, even if it's exaggerated, again, we should have a healthy fear of it. I think it's really, really important. So Marcelo.
Yet again, the Russians would probably say, well, Nina, you do not, you talk to your dogs, but you do not expect them to answer you.
Right.
Why waste time? We just had, what's her name? Kaja Kallas, who's supposed to come in the place of Joseph Borrell. Everybody knows Joseph Borrell, right? And now we have
Yes.
Kaja Kallas.
Who knew that there could be someone worse than the gardener?
Just yesterday, the Farinazo, a friend of mine, and who has another channel called Art of War, just said in an interview, about the Brazilian parliament. Saying that was not a parliament, but I'll call parliament because I miss the English word now. Just saying that if you think this parliament is bad, expect the next one.
Right. If you think this government is bad, expect the next one. Yeah, I think it's kind of a very interchangeable quote. Yeah. So if you thought Angela Merkel was bad, take a look at Scholz. I think that's what I've been saying. But yeah, definitely something to consider. So Marcelo, do you have any questions, or have we kind of addressed everything? And do you have any final words
a final thought was that the map, you're not going to be seeing on the screen now. I just put it on the screen here. A map that I very childishly draw with 300 kilometer circles coming all the way from the tip of Belarus with Ukraine until Odessa. Not Odessa, until Crimea. So because Odessa is still not Russia. And what remains, you're going to see it on the video replay, but people on the screen can see. what remains of Ukraine after 300 kilometers. And that's just considering, that Russia is going to create a buffer zone just to take care of these attackams, because the Storm Shadows and some other French, Germans, what's the German one? Whatever, they have even longer range missiles. So this is just to have an idea about 300 kilometers, whatever will remain of Ukraine if Russia decides, and will have to. It's not about the decision, it's about being forced to push a buffer zone of security to Russia and Belarus.
Yeah, pretty sobering, I think, for the residents of of those places. But yeah, it's, we talked about this on our Russian army episode. I mean, but it's come up before, where this is what Stalin did after World War II. It was not so much about, I want to be the king of the world and control Poland. It was like, I'm going to push the border and my sort of area of influence as far away from Russia proper, right, the Soviet Union proper, as possible, because Russia has been invaded through the Polish corridor on multiple occasions, whether it was Napoleon, whether it was Hitler. So that was the thinking. And so this is sort of a miniature version of that, of pushing the border, right, scare quotes, away from the official borders of the Russian Federation. We could maybe exclude the new regions from this idea. If we're thinking of the new regions that Russia considers its own, but the international community doesn't yet, then it's going to be even farther, right? Even farther to the west. But yeah, definitely something to consider. Do you have any questions? Have we addressed everything? And also any parting words from you?
There is one question on the chat that I think it would be interesting to address. And this is, if a global thermonuclear war broke out, what would Marcelo and Nina have for last dinner?
Well, I plan to survive because I'm pretty far removed from the important centers of North America. But of course, there could be like a cloud that's going to block out the sun. I might have to go catch some elk out here. I was actually really sad. I'm not opposed to hunting. I personally do not hunt myself, and I do eat meat. But I also don't like seeing, like beautiful animals that you see out in nature and then people shoot them. So I just recently saw a truck with 2 dead elk that have been shot. I'm hoping that the person who shot them was going to eat them and fully utilize them, but it still just made me feel very sad because I've seen elk in the wild and they're huge, right? If you think of a deer and now think of a giant deer, right? That's an elk. I don't think you guys have elk in Europe. I mean, there are other types of deer, right? Reindeer, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, but they're just beautiful, big animals. And yes, people eat elk meat. But anyway, I was just like, I'm so sad. I know people eat them, but it's like, I don't like seeing dead elk because they're such gorgeous animals. And anyway, so I'm thinking if there's like a giant cloud that's blocking out the sun and there's nothing else to eat, I might have to go get some elk. That might be my last. But hopefully we're not going to get to that point.
Well, I hunt all the way from my house to the supermarket, and I would have a big barbecue.
Barbecued elk. I'll fax you some barbecued elk, even though I'm really not a
elk.
Yeah. So,
but I'll put some chicken heart.
I know. Hopefully we don't have to be at that point. So. So yeah, hopefully we have good thoughts. Hopefully there's cooperation, a lot of behind the scenes back channel communication between, the U.S., the actual decision makers in the US. We don't know who they actually are, and the Russian decision makers. And there is some kind of a realism and de-escalation that can be achieved. And I think that all the Kayas of the world are just going to follow the overlord is going to say jump and Kaya Kallas is going to say how high, because remember her parents were pretty important in the Soviet Union. She obviously rebranded herself as this anti-Soviet, anti-Russian freedom fighter. She can rebrand herself again, although I suspect people like her, I just call them middle managers. They get chosen to occupy a particular bureaucratic seat. It doesn't really matter who is in that seat. And the next person that replaces them is going to be just as useful or useless, depending on your perception. So that's all I have for you guys. Hopefully this was helpful. A lot of history blabbing. But history can teach us that even two superpower adversaries can communicate. That means that hopefully should communicate and could communicate. And so hopefully the countries that are currently in conflict could communicate so that we can continue not eating elk and we can just eat our regular meals. Barbecue is still good. So so everyone wish Marcelo to get enough sleep because he seems to be reaching my levels of sleep deprivation, and that's never healthy.
That's never healthy.
That's never
and I would
healthy.
like also to remember everybody that all the links are on the description. If you want to help the channels, you can send super chats, or for Brazilians, you can use Pix. For Nina, you can buy her a coffee. She'll be very happy. She needs coffee. Also do I. I should make her buy me a coffee.
I accept super chats too, so don't exclude me from
you have
that.
super chat as well now.
I do.
So super chats for Nina as well. And thank you very much, everybody. Nina, you have any last words before we finish this episode?
We will see you next week, free of any nuclear exchanges. And
let's keep positive. That's why
we're gonna stay positive. We're gonna hope that the threat is being exaggerated, but we're gonna maintain a healthy fear thereof, like we discussed. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you very soon. Bye.
Bye bye.